This is the essence of the Southern residents right here. These big social groups in Harrow Strait. I mean, when we think of J's, K's, and L's, that's what we think of, is them on the west side of San Juan Island. And they're known for being these really surface active whales that swim close to shore through the kelp beds off Kiln State Park. And these summer afternoons of the whales doing the west side shuffle and them going north and south, and there's nothing like that feeling of sitting on the rocks and seeing that line of whales approaching. And that's how I fell in love with the Southern residents. That's how so many people fell in love with the Southern residents. You know, I was a high school student out interning and making acoustic recordings at the lighthouse, and there was a whole crew of us out there that would spend our summers at the lighthouse. And when the whales would come, we'd all scramble down onto the rocks together, and you didn't want to leave because you might miss something. So that meant taking a nap on the rocks with the ID guide underneath you and waking up to climb up to the top of the lighthouse and watch the next pass by. And when we did occasionally watch pass-bys from up there, it was an amazing perspective looking down on these whales as they swam by right at our feet. And we used to talk about the 3-star pass-by, one of those super pods in the kelp. I love telling the story about June 2002 when we came up here and spent the last 2 weeks of June here on San Juan Island. And in 13 days, I saw the whales on 12 of those days, 22 pass-bys, 3 super pods, and all from the west side of San Juan Island. And it was just incredible. And even when we started the Orca Behavior Institute in 2015, and we got our boat in the water at the beginning of June, and it was June 9th, and we headed out on our vessel Serenity, and we encountered J-pod and a big portion of L-pod socializing off False Bay. And you can see the smiles speak for themselves. It was an incredible encounter, and that's what we had dreamed of as we watched the whales on the west side of San Juan Island, was getting out there and experiencing those same things from a research perspective. And even as recently as a few years ago, you know, you could go out to Kiln for a summer sunset and fully expect that the whales might show up, or they could surprise you coming around the lighthouse like they did on this particular evening, just slowly swimming through the kelp beds. And that's what summer on San Juan Island was all about. And all the rest of the year you would dream about those summer evenings and those super pod encounters at Kiln. And I just went back and looked through my notes, and the last super pod at Kiln was in September of 2016. June 20th, 2020, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, we would have expected to see the Southern residents dozens of times by now here at Kiln. This year, haven't seen them once. We knew this trend was happening when we published our first paper in 2018. It was about the declining spring usage of the Salish Sea by the Southern residents, particularly in the months of April through June. And it was something that had been dropping off since 2005, kind of first in April and then a little more in May and then a little more in June. But we never thought it would get to a point like this, where this year there was a single sighting of J-pod on the evening of April 10th up in the Strait of Georgia. But other than that, look at those red X's piling up. Virtually not here in April, not here in May, and not here in June as the days continue to tick off the calendar. It's crazy to sit here and think about what it used to be like. it wasn't that long ago that we were coming down here all the time to see the southern residents, and I would always tell people second half of June, that's the best time to come and see them here, and you can just sit at Lime Kiln for a couple days and you're practically guaranteed to see them. And then now it's just been declining and they're here less and less until last year. It was the first June on record when the southern residents weren't in the Salish Sea at all, and it really feels like we're headed towards the second June this year. And it's kind of scary how quickly we've sort of gotten used to that. Like, nobody's talking about when they're going to return because we don't really expect them to return. And when I sit and think about it, it's just like a punch to the gut. And it's not hard to see what's going on if you take a look at the average Albion catch per unit effort numbers, which is a Fraser River Chinook test fishery for the month of May. Look at the correlation between the fish numbers in green and the whale presence in the Salish Sea in blue. And then you see the big fish drop off in 2005 and the whales follow suit, declining until not here in 2018 in the month of May and again in 2020. Here's the same thing looking at the month of June with the Fraser River Chinook numbers in green and the southern resident presence in blue. And you'll see the big drop off of fish in 2005 and the whale sightings start to decline, dropping pretty sharply until they weren't here at all in 2019 and possibly again in 2020. So what are people doing with this data? Well, unfortunately, both sides of the border are continuing to spend a lot of time talking about vessel effects, in particular small vessels. In Washington State, the biggest activity this year is the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife conducting a process about licensing commercial whale watching vessels to establish limitations for their time and distance spent around the southern residents. And it sounds great on paper, but we've been through this vessel rulemaking several times now since the endangered listing of the whales, and it seems a little ridiculous, quite frankly, at times to be talking about additional vessel regulations around whales that aren't even here. And on the Canadian side of the border, they're doing a little bit better, but it's a lot of the same thing. So the whole orange area on this map is distance restrictions about approaching the southern residents. The small red zones are interim sanctuary zones, which are basically no-go zones for boats. And then the yellow regions are seasonal fishery closures, so no fishing can happen in those areas. And the thing that I like most about this is that the orange protection area kind of extends out the western Strait of Juan de Fuca, which is where the whales are spending a lot of their time in the late spring and throughout the summer. As far as we know, we get a few reports of them out there. So that region makes a little bit more sense. But again, this is primarily about vessels. There's some regional fishing closures, but fishing can still happen everywhere else. And it doesn't really matter if there aren't many fish there to begin with. While I've been sitting here on the rocks, a friend just sent me a link to an article that was published yesterday by CBC saying that Ottawa is taking unprecedented action to protect Fraser River Chinook salmon on behalf of the southern resident killer whales. That's great news. That's exactly what we want to be seeing. But when I looked into the details of it, it includes some fishing area closures and some size restrictions on the Chinook that you can keep. But one of the major pieces of the rule is that you can't fish within 1,000 meters of a killer whale when they're in the Salish Sea. But is it really a harvest production if you can't fish within 1,000 meters of a killer whale that's not here? It's, you know, we're finally starting to talk a little bit about fish, but these aren't the kind of big actions that we need. And we need to be talking about habitat and major salmon recovery. And until we figure out how to recover Chinook salmon on the Fraser River, the southern residents aren't going to return to the Salish Sea very often, and encounters like this on the west side of San Juan Island will remain a memory. And it's so frustrating that nobody's talking about the fact that the whales aren't here and why they aren't here. And looking at footage of encounters like these, it's just heartbreaking.